Okay, we will start with our first affirmative speaker, please.
Standing at the edge of one of the biggest changes to this country's taxation system. We have the opportunity to help the most privileged members of society and help those who are the most disadvantaged. 3 things in this speech then. The first is some notes on setup, secondly on how we work to solve the housing crisis, and then lastly on how we enforce a mode of progressive taxation. On to setup then, I think the most important question to ask ourselves firstly is how is this tax going to be implemented? I think this is largely intuitive, however, it looks like a certain percentage tax of the market value on this land, not that this is determined by the market and thus analysed by your local council. I think note here then that land in different areas of the country is worth more. This looks like land in central Auckland being worth a lot more than a farm down in Invercargill. Secondly then, I think we need to ask, why do we have so much empty land in the country, especially in larger cities? I think the biggest reason here is speculation. A lot of rich people, a lot of banks, a lot of hedge funds, etc. are often buying up land in hopes that it appreciates in value in the future, in hopes that they can sell it for a very large amount of profit. Why do they do it? Why do they do this? I think firstly, keeping your land empty means that there are no associated costs in terms of building maintenance. Note that we reverse this. I'll explain that in my first point. And then secondly, we tell you that owning land is viewed as a really good long-term investment. There are a lot of people entering New Zealand, moving to larger, more urban cities, which means the demand of land is increasing over time. This looks like a really good way to make some money. This results in a lot of land being over-speculated, a lot of empty land existing in the country. I think the next thing to ask then is who is taxed. I think I've already alluded to this, but it looks like a lot of really wealthy people who own huge plots of really valuable land, and a lot of development countries that are simply sitting on their land waiting for the opportunity to actually do something. Note here then that both of these groups of people have a lot amount of money, they have a lot of capacity in terms of paying this tax, they're likely to not have that much difficulty with it. Next then, moving on to my point about the housing crisis, before that I am going to take a point.
Hey, why don't areas, people that take up a lot of land, such as farmers, also get hit by this tax really hard?
So note that I told you in my setup that the value of land is determined by the location, noting that a lot of farms are located in particularly rural areas where there isn't much urbanization, where there aren't many large companies, a lot of people existing. They're probably going to be taxed at far lower rates than land that is owned in larger cities such as Auckland, such as Wellington. Moving on to my next point then about the housing crisis. I think what you need to note here, note that councils are pretty inefficient when it comes to building houses, when it comes to developing land. And then secondly, I already told you, a lot of people are moving into larger cities. I think ultimately this means that there are a lot of people and not enough houses, and the very few houses that are available are often very expensive. How do we fix this then? A couple reasons. Firstly, we incentivize the usage of land. Note that a lot of people probably don't want to pay tax without getting some form of returns. What does this mean for really wealthy people, for development countries who own plots of empty land? It means that they're likely to develop this land that they own, right? They want to make their money back. They don't want to be continuously paying tax. This means that they're gonna build houses to sell, to rent. This just means people have more houses overall. Secondly, we tell you that buildings are just going to be built more efficiently. Owners of the land have an incentive to build quicker because so as to cover the cost of this tax sooner. They don't want to accrue tax over multiple years. They're likely to act quickly. Now, secondly, I think we need to answer why are these houses attainable? Why are people actually going to be able to access this increased number of houses that are built? I think first of all note that if there are more houses, there are more companies that are creating houses, there is a certain amount of competition to actually sell these houses and make some of that money back. That means prices are going to be reasonably low so people can actually purchase them. And I think secondly, even if you don't buy the existence of competition, note that these owners still want to make money, which means they're not going to price their houses at such an egregious price when no one can pay for them, where they can't make this money that they need. What do we see at the end of this then? I think first of all, we simply just see more development on empty plots of land. This looks like a lot more houses being available. This means for the average person, you have more of an opportunity to buy a house. You probably have more choice, and these houses are probably a lot cheaper for you and easier for you to attain. This is particularly important. And then I think secondly, on employment, when there are more houses being built, this means you need more builders. This means you need more electricians. This means you need more plumbers. This looks like a lot more employment opportunities for people working in the trades. This is particularly good. But I think secondly, on employment, when houses are built quicker, this means that the average individual is going to be receiving a lot more projects. Note that builders are often contractors. They get paid on the amount of projects they work. If we can increase the amount of houses they're working on, we're increasing their income. Note that these people work really laborious jobs. They give their bodies and their health to their jobs. If we're able to make their lives easier by increasing their income, this is a particularly good thing. Moving on to my second point then, on progressive taxation. What do you need to know here? Note that taxing every single piece of empty land in this country, it makes the government a lot of money. The government ends up with a lot of revenue. Two reasons why. I think I already gave you money on speculation, why there's a lot of land that's currently empty. And then secondly, New Zealand is just reasonably geographically large. There is lots of there is lots of land that is available to be taxed. How are we able to enforce more progressive tax then? I think first of all, taxing land that is owned by wealthy people is inherently progressive in itself. You're taxing the rich proportionally more, which means you're taxing the poor proportionately less. And this means you're able to redirect income from rich people who probably get tax cuts, who probably evade tax on a daily basis. It means why we think you're progressing these rich people more. Firstly, wealthy people just own more land than poorer, more disadvantaged people do. These are people who own houses, who own bigger plots of land, who own land in more valuable areas of the country. I think secondly then, the government just wants to be popular. They want to appeal to the majority of the population. They want to be voted in again. What does this mean? This means they want to seem like they're actually fixing issues faced by the majority of their population. I think this results in the government, if they have the money to do so, which I've already explained to you that they will, they're probably going to lower other taxes that are more proximate to the average person, that affect the average person at a higher rate. This looks like income tax. This looks like GST, that people who aren't as wealthy have to pay proportionately larger amounts of. And I think secondly, this results in a lot more social spending. This results in a lot more subsidies from this increased revenue that the government has. This looks like funding hospitals in more rural areas. This looks like funding better quality schools in more disadvantaged areas. What do we get at the end of this then? I think first of all, stuff is just more affordable for the average person. Not that I told you that we have a housing crisis, but in general, it's becoming very expensive to just live, to buy groceries. I've already proved why the government has a larger amount of money, why they're incentivized to spend this money in a good way and lower taxes for the average person. This means that this means that more disadvantaged people can just get by easier. This is a particularly good thing. And then I think secondly, a lot of people are going to be generally happier. They're probably going to feel better about their lives. Financial stress is something that is all consuming, when you are stretching like $20 over a week, you're probably gonna have a really hard time. You're not gonna feel really good about yourself. So if we're able to decrease the amount of costs spent by the average person, if we are able to provide even a little bit of emotional ease, this is really good. I think, why else should you think this is important? I think simply just on principle, if we are, people who are wealthy just have more capacity, they have more of a capability to pay for things. These other people who should be feeling more proud to
Thank the speaker for this speech and invite up first Meg.
One third of New Zealand's land is owned by the Department of Conservation and is uninhabited for that reason. It is not fair nor reasonable for the affirmative side to claim that investors have bought up every single piece of land in New Zealand and that is why it is not being claimed, right? I think this isn't true, and in fact, these organisations are people who get really, really harmed in this debate alongside your everyday person. A couple of things to do. Firstly, on some framing, then on housing and rent, this directly opposes their housing material, and then on unprofitable land. Okay, so on framing. So what does this tax likely to look like, right? We're here that it's calculated based on the value of the land for the motion, right? I think this looks like two main things. Firstly, wide areas of land, things like farms, which this contested. I just think it's probably quite intuitive that in a country that relies a lot on farming for economy, really wide, flat stretches of land are really valuable. And I think secondly, and we agree with the other team, right? It looks valuable for the sake of location. This looks like smaller patches of land, but they're in the suburbs in Auckland, or they're big enough to have a house on it, right? But if there's just a piece of land in Auckland that just can fit a house, right? So it's runs you a couple $100,000 as a person, right? They tell us that this is taxed at a higher rate. This works for our case. So maybe it's a counter model or something that's you raise the top tax from 10% to earn the same amount of revenue as ACT, if we have kind of fiat for that. But I also just generally who is taxed, right? I think they tell us it's only wealthy people. I think yes, sometimes wealthy people do own a lot of land, but I also think a lot of land is owned by eco-sanctuaries, by ministries, by conservation, and by iwi, right? I think this is quite important. So then, why is a lot of land empty in New Zealand? I just talked about this in the intro. A third is owned by DOC, not investors. It's empty because of the amount of land we need for conservation. This land actually gets bought up, they talk about, when DOC is broke, can't afford it anymore, and sells it to some random oil company, right? Okay. Then on housing and rent. Okay, so some context here, right? So houses are extremely expensive, right? There's a barrier to entry, and a huge population of this cost is the land that sits. A huge proportion of this cost is that land that the house sits on rather than the house itself, right? I think houses become more difficult to buy on their side of the house. Four mechanisms here. Firstly, right, the upfront cost is just higher, right? When you are going to the bank, you just need to take out a much bigger mortgage. There are just more costs attached to the house. Secondly, it's just harder to meet mortgage payments, right? There's thousands more added onto it. This means that people are just locked out of the housing market, almost delay their buying for a number of years, right? And rental prices then soar. Why do rental prices then soar? A couple of reasons. Firstly, a house isn't an elastic band, right? In either world, you just need a place to live. The comparative is that you rent if you can't afford to buy a house. I think secondly, supply and demand, right? The supply of rental properties stays the same or goes down because land gets more expensive and the opportunity cost of just like running more properties becomes higher. Then the demand for rent goes up. More people need a house. The price just shoots through the roof, right? I think thirdly here, like the land is like landlord profit incentives at play, right? If you believe that like there's just more expensive costs, landlords just like pass extra costs onto the consumer or just skip more extra commodities. Even like $75 more in your rent is just really, really bad for the most vulnerable people within this debate, right? I think fourthly, just increase landlord power, right? Tenants just don't have the power to move away or like call out the landlord for their poor dwellings. Like, yeah. So, fourthly here, like this like hundreds of thousands of dollars just like can't be spent anymore by these groups. That's the wrong point, I'm so sorry. So the outcomes of this point, right? I think that like buying homes is just harder and like more expensive, right? There's like two main groups impacted here, right? People who previously could buy a house and now can't. Just it's bad because they just have no more security, right? Having a house is confirmed, sets up for the future. Now maybe like your kids just like wouldn't have to move schools as much. Maybe you're just like less susceptible to future economic like problems and rent hikes, right? And secondly here, like people who could never afford to buy a house in the first place for at least a fair while, right? These people just have to pay more rent every single week. You like make budget concessions, right? You just can't buy as much like food or healthy food for your kids. You just can't send your kids to like as good of a school or like play a certain sport, right? There's just generally less joy and opportunity in your life. I think like you also just like simply can't afford to like rent a house anymore, right? Even if like 2,000 people just can't afford to rent a house anymore, this is detrimental for the debate, right? I think that like the way in here is that your life is just completely shattered. You sleep in the cold, you struggle to you just get into like a cycle of poverty, you struggle with homelessness. Like it doesn't have to be many for us to weigh this heavily. Before I move on to the next point, I'll take a POI.
Insofar as people who physically cannot afford rent will not pay it, and landlords will thus not make money, why is this rent likely to get so insanely expensive, as you say?
Sorry, can you repeat the first half?
Insofar as people who physically cannot afford rent will not pay it, and thus landlords will not receive money, why is this rent likely to get so insanely expensive?
I don't see how putting a tax on land means people who can't pay rent magically can pay rent. I think that like the main thing is that the value of the land itself, the plot the house is on, adds a couple $100,000 to how much you have to be paying like in your mortgage overall, right? I think that is where the harm in this debate comes. So on unprofitable land, right? The context here, there are many groups that do important work on land that do not make a lot of profit. I think this looks like EDI. I think this looks like Department of Conservation, right? Like, no, this just needs significantly more land than like a house, so it plays a lot into this debate, right? I think what work are they doing? They're doing things like Ngāi Tahu doing like positive work for disaffected Māori communities in New Zealand, right? Things like having marae or like community like spaces on this land, right? I think also looks like, like DOC, like preserving, caring for endangered species, like eco-sanctuaries, like protected land, ecosystems, tourism, etc., right? Note these aren't profitable endeavours. While marae is very beneficial, it is not very profitable. I think adding like hundreds of thousands of dollars to these like organizations' operating costs every year is detrimental. A couple mechanisms here. So firstly, like per the context I just gave you, there's actually non-profits that like rely on volunteers and donations. Note here, village donations just won't come in the same if general costs for like living are just higher. Secondly, these groups require large amounts of land to do good work, right? Like Auckland Eco-Sanctuary needs different areas for different types of like birds and wildlife. Or like in the status quo, these places are taxed quite equitably because of the development and building of this land's nature, right? Note, this tax is not means tested. It is regardless of any buildings or improvements upon the land. This means that the tax won't take charitable states and like wealth into account, right? These people just get taxed as much as everyone else. That's detrimental for these people. I think thirdly, these like hundreds of thousands of dollars just can't be spent by these groups anymore. Like in the best case, you just can't do as much good, right? Like you just like do conservation work, like you just can't do like that conservation work along the Otago Peninsula anymore. But then in the worst case, you just can't afford to have a lot of this land. Maybe just sell off your ancestral homeland. Maybe just like sell more mining permits to oil companies. Like I don't know. Outcomes here, like these places just can't operate like they used to. There's less spaces for commodity iwi to feel like spiritual connection, psychological benefit to the land. Like when they go through other struggles and they really just think like something like this is really bad. And like eco sanctuaries, right? Like ecosystems are just tangibly really damaged. There is less land available to rehabilitate like the kia or the kiwi or the kakapo. Maybe there's just less money to do the endeavours regardless, right? This is really important because of permanence. Once an animal goes extinct, you can never go back. At the end of all of this, I think not only does like housing rent just get worse for everyone, including all the vulnerable people they try to win on, but you also just totally screw over some of the most important like organisations in New Zealand. I protest.
I thank the speaker for their speech and invite up second act.
Empty land isn't just conservation parks. Empty land is land that is bought by speculators just because they think there's going to be an increase in the price in the future. Empty land is the least economically productive good that we have here in New Zealand. So proud to enforce a tax on, let me repeat, empty land. Three things I want to do in the speech. First, I want to work what Mishti says about taxes, and then I'll show how that basically addresses a lot of what First Neg says about the Department of Conservation and with iwi. Second, I want to talk about the other main push about rent and housing. Thirdly, and finally, I want to introduce an extension on how we uniquely revitalise rural areas. Cool. What did Mishti say about tax? She said a few things. First, she told you that there was lots of empty land in this country. I think, as far as I can hear from the Negating House, they more or less agree with that. What that means then, there's a huge amount of land to tax, there's a lot of revenue to be made from that. But then secondly, she also said that land, empty land, particularly in cities, was very, very expensive. This tax is based on market value. That's another way for the government to make oodles of money. Then she mechanises for you why the government is likely to give that surplus back to the average person. She tells you that governments, guess what, want to be re-elected. She tells you that average people, guess what, will use their vote to make their own lives easier. What you should believe then, with the lack of engagement from First Neg, is that the average person pays less in things like income tax. The average person pays less in things like GST, but simultaneously the government also has more money to play with. That brings me on to what they say about DOC and about iwi. I'll address both of those things differently. First, on Department of Conservation, I'll say three things here. First, I just want to point out that the Department of Conservation is part of the government. The government doesn't need to pay taxes to itself. This represents no extra burden on the Department of Conservation. But then secondly, we preempt this very idea with the idea of more revenue. Even if you think our taxes don't get through, that means the government simply has more money to spend on the upkeep of things like conservation parks, on things like DOC. Sorry, not TOC, that's the IP. Then thirdly and finally, I think that even if we have to bite the bullet, they can literally just sell this land to private contractors so the government doesn't need to absorb any of this cost, right? What that means then is the government can still get revenue from this kind of sale, but then also pass the cost off to someone else who probably can make money off things like tourism. Then let's talk about iwi. Two things here. First, I'm going to expand on this a bit later. Iwi are often, we preempt this kind of already, iwi are often located in very remote parts of the country. That means that the amount of value that their land has is not even comparable to, say, a place like Auckland. That means the tax that they face is very, very marginal indeed. But then I'll flip this, I promise, in about 4 minutes as to why the more important issue is the economic crisis gripping our rural communities. At the end of this then, you should believe that species don't go extinct under our watch. I think that's a little unfair. And then secondly, iwi don't get driven out of their ancestral lands. Cool. Let me move on to the other push about housing. As I'll note again, I think Mishti preemptively deals with a lot of this material when she says that there is lots of land that is held simply because of the ability to speculate, and because it seems like such a good long-term investment. What we do then uniquely is we balance the incentive for people with the most capacity in the economy to build more houses. Cool. What do they say? They tell us about upfront costs. That's why people don't build houses. A little confused because they face this much of the same upfront costs, right? The cost to cart lumber into Auckland, the cost to connect it to the electricity grid. Not sure why that's different. But then secondly, they tell us about things like inelastic goods. Thank you for making our case for us. It's profitable to build houses. That's why they're likely to build houses instead of just selling it off to someone else. Then they tell us about supply and demand adjusting the. Then they tell us about supply and demand. Again, as I'll note to you, as Mishti points out in her POI, if rent is ungodly high, then people will probably move out of the place where rent is ungodly high. But then at the end of all of this, what does Mishti's case actually tell you? We tax unproductive land that isn't being used for anything. Just intuitively then, you should believe that there is an increase in the quantity and the supply of housing in the first place. When there is a higher quantity, then firms have to compete against each other to lower the price. But it also means that consumers have more of a choice as to where they park. That means on the long term, lower prices for consumers. That's less of a financial burden. We can co-opt all of their benefits. Before I move on, I'll take a point.
When more people are renting instead of buying, if you're a landlord and one tenant can't pay, can't you just find another person?
I don't think that engages entirely with the material of what we say. The main thrust of our case today is everywhere across the country, empty land, unproductive land is used to build houses. That increases the supply, that increases the competition that firms have to deal with. Cool. Then they talk about farmers. I probably sound a bit like a broken record. I think we've already framed out as to why farmers are the least affected because they're remote, the value of their land isn't that high in the first place. But I want to add two things to this discussion. First, the market value of farms is uniquely low because of the flip of what Misty said about maintenance costs, right? You need, if you buy a farm, to keep all the animals fed, you need to give them medicine, water, you have to keep your pastures fertilized. That's incredibly high cost. That means that the average firm just sees farming land as particularly undesirable, the market price is low, the burden that they face is not very high. But then secondly, they argue against themselves when they say that there are many, many farmers in this country. What that means then is you should believe that there are many farms in this country. That means that in order to compete in selling their land off, that means that the average price of their farms probably is low. But then let me introduce my extension about how we uniquely revitalize rural and less urban areas. The context of this point is that growth is not happening equally around this country. We can fix that in 3 different ways. First, the comparatively lower cost in the long term then of building something, say, in Palmerston North as opposed to central Wellington. Note that aggregate demand still exists. As long as there are people in these rural communities, there is a demand for things like groceries. Then secondly, we give a leg up for smaller local businesses in rural areas, right? Businesses, again, in a place like Hastings, contend with lower costs in this thing compared to, say, Woolworths. What that means then is they're uniquely more able to compete against these larger companies. Then thirdly, we just have more government revenue to reinvest back into the community, in things like schools and hospitals, things that keep the quality of life high and make people stay in these rural communities. 3 impacts of this then. First, we shift permanent and long-term infrastructure towards these more rural, less urban communities. What that looks like then is a Fonterra processing plant, instead of being built on the outskirts of Auckland, is more likely to be built somewhere in, say, the Waikato or New Plymouth. But then secondly, that attracts more employment, right? People need to be employed at these plants, people need to build these things. That's uniquely a good to the local people. Thirdly and finally, I think we just get more people in them. Right? You revitalise rural towns in the long term, you get people in there, spending in local businesses, pushing food back on the table for these people, you reverse this economic decline. Why should you weigh this highly? Because of the massive marginal change we get for small towns. Instead of packing up your bags and moving away, look, this applies to iwi and to farmers, you actually get food on the table. But then we also fulfill that principle that Mishti gives you about the government needing to take care of its most vulnerable citizens. For a government that prioritises the least privileged in our community, to make the people with the most capacity pay their fair share, please, please, please vote F.
I thank the speaker for the speech and invite second Neg.
Loses this debate when they refuse to engage with the fact that more than just billionaires are able to buy literal houses. Okay, what am I going to do in my speech? Firstly on setup, then on housing, then on like those with like lots of land, this is like your community stuff, and then lastly on their push on progressive taxation. Okay, the setup here. What does this tax look like? We agree with that is like a lot about like the location and land, right? But also we tell you that it's the amount of land that matters. 1 + 1 = 2. If you have big amounts of land, you have to pay more because it is literally just more land, right? They haven't engaged with this. Okay, I think this means a lot of our points still stand. Okay then, firstly, who owns land? They tell you that it's only the richest, only the most billionaire of billionaires that own it. Look, I think this is just like really, really unreasonable. We tell you that anyone is able to own land. As I told you in my intro, literal, people who just buy a house, they own land now. We tell you about like indigenous groups, we tell you about like community groups, right? I think this means a lot more people are affected by this tax than AF would like you to believe. Okay then, lastly on like their push about empty land. They tell you that empty land is really bad because it will just sit there until like the tax base people pay for. I think this is not valid for a couple reasons. Firstly, note in places like New Zealand, half of this land is just unusable because it's like smack bang in the middle of the Southern Alps. To some degree, the land is always useless. Okay then, or like it's just like arid and barren, like and it's just never valued. But then secondly, there is always a profit incentive for you to develop your land. There is always a profit incentive for you to like go build stuff and like increase the value of it. That is just like an economic fact. Okay then, on housing. What do they tell you? They tell you that firstly they incentivize usage of land. I think the case under their own reasoning of the profit incentive. I think you gain the most profit by building on your land when you build rentals. You don't build houses to sell, you build rentals. You are still in control of land, you make people pay. And secondly, I tell you, there is always a profit incentive. On our side, you still like develop land because it just makes you money. That is like the rich people always develop it and makes you money. That is always going to happen. But then secondly, they tell you that the houses will get built faster. This is kind of funny because firstly, on either side of the debate, equipment sitting on that empty land costs money. My dad drives past the Negating hospital every day and he gets mad because containers are just sitting there. There is always an incentive for like building to happen fast. And then secondly, again, people want to make money. I think it's just like symmetrical here. What do we then tell you about how housing prices actually rise? We give you 4 mechanisms. We tell you about the upfront cost. The average person saves money all their life to buy their first home, but now it's like a $400,000 house and $500,000 land. You are paying so much more on your mortgage every year. That's just an upfront cost you have to face, right? What do they like? They don't engage with this at all. Instead, think that you're going to believe that only the billionaires in New Zealand own houses. I think this is just blatantly untrue. What then do we also tell you? We tell you about supply and demand, and this is a key metric here. And then they tell you, but it's okay because landlords won't raise the price because people will just move away. I think when we tell you that it's harder to buy houses, you just intuitively have more people renting. What this means then is that if you can raise the price for every person that can't afford it and can't pay your rent, you just find someone else because no one can can buy the houses. If one person can't pay, you'll find another. And note here, that under AF's own system, like tenants now just have less power and the landlords have more. This is like lobbying the government to decrease like tenant laws, right? I think that is a huge harm they have to cop on their side. And lastly, on landlord profit, per their own reason of wanting land to be profitable. When these landlords have to pay like extra tax on the land each year, they either like, I don't know, raise the rent or they just decrease the quality of the houses. Now you don't have heating in your house and like landlords still get their profit margin because of this crucial supply and demand like mechanism that is unresponded to. I think you have to accept at the end of this clash, the average person now has to rent a house that is so much worse off. Before, there's this large group of people who are like middle class, right? They could have bought a house, they could have gotten security, but thanks to AF's case, now they can't, now they have to rent. This not only pushes up the rent price for those people, but then at the poorest, the margins of society, who would never have any choice but to rent, now are so much worse off because instead of buying new shoes for their kid, they now have to pay that on rent. That is such a huge harm that they have not done enough work to mitigate at all. Okay then. On those with like land, like lots of it. Firstly, they tell you about like dogs. I think this is kind of example bashing. Note there are many environmental community groups like, I don't know, like Orokonuri or like the Otago Peninsula Rocks, the Watch. These people own, like these are local organisations that own land that may work to maintain it, right? These people are hit by the tax, right? And even if you take their mechanism out, oh, the government just gives them money back. This is firstly like ridiculous, it probably doesn't, like because the government has so many areas to focus on. And secondly, even if this is just completely true, then you've just had more admin and you still get the same amount of money. I think that's just like a waste of time. Okay then, they tell you about iwi and they expect you to buy all the rural land there. Oh, and I also say farmers. I don't really understand the rural land point. It's like they're saying like because everyone gets hit by this tax, like people who get hit by this tax list like just now have less operation costs and like actually bad. I think when farmers have to pay more for their land, I think that means they have higher operational costs. I think that means they sell you your food for more money. I think when their own context about how living is already really hard, I think you just mean you have to pay more for meat at the supermarket. I think that is a huge harm they have to cop. And when they don't engage with the fact that like more than just billionaires buy the land, I think they just lose all the benefits they try to tell you about how like rural land will get developed because if now everyone can buy land. Okay then, lastly on progressive taxation. They tell you that they're going to tax. They tell you firstly that this makes the government like more popular. I think when half of the population is conservative leaning, meaning that they think taxes on the rich like stifle progress, like ruin success incentives. I think this means it is in fact not popular with half the government. I think that's like, you can't just buy that everyone is like a super woke conservative. Super woke liberal. Okay, secondly, they tell you that taxing the rich is really good. I think, look, I already told you, more than billionaires own land. When you tax the average person, they can't buy a house, they raise their rent, that is just so much worse. And lastly, they on government revenue. Like we tell you, we have the counterfeit to place our own tax, right? They haven't contested this at all. What this means is then we just get the same benefits they have now claimed, sure.
If firms on both sides of the house have equal incentive to build houses, why don't you prefer giving them the extra capacity of idle land in West Auckland?
Because then you hurt the average person who just wants to buy a house to support their like 3 kids, right? They now can't buy the house, they now rent, they get screwed over by the landlord who doesn't pay for their heating. I think that is a huge harm on their side. Your third is going to have to do a lot of work on that. Okay then, what am I telling you about counterfeit? We tell you that we get the same government revenue because we just like raise the tax on the top 10%. We tell you this at first, they haven't responded to it. And then this means all their mechanisms on like government revenue and like giving back to the communities and all like revitalising and like spending more on social services, I think that's just symmetrical on both sides, right? Okay, at the end of this debate, what should you believe? You should believe that it's now harder to buy a house for the average person. More people rent. This means landlords have more power to screw over the average renter. This means those, the most vulnerable in society, now are just so much worse off. They have to budget so much harder. They give up all the most important things in their life. We have won this debate. I'm so proud to stand.
Take the speaker for their speech and invite third F to give their speech.
We have fear to implement this policy, but even if we don't believe that, we still win. Because if it is so unpopular, it means the government has to justify absolutely everything. And because they have to justify it, that's when they lower GST, that's when they lower income taxes, that's when a lot of these people, these most vulnerable people, are able to benefit. A few things in this speech. Firstly, on this whole idea of iwi, dock, unused lands, etc. Secondly, on rent and housing. Finally, I want to do some weighing on rural communities. Firstly then, on this whole idea of iwi and dock. They tell us that dock owns 1/3 of the entire, of New Zealand, but we notice a few things. Firstly, we'd say that obviously DOC doesn't need to pay taxes insofar as it is literally a part of the government. The government doesn't pay taxes to itself. But secondly, we'd say that the government now has more revenue to be able to spend on conservation now. Because you do a tax on land, you're able to reinvest some of that money to help a lot of these conservation initiatives. Note that if you don't tax this land, you can't direct this money to certain issues. So once you have a pool of money, you can directly invest this, for example, into ecology initiatives, into various things, whereas in the comparative, you can't, because that money just stays with the value of the land. But even if you don't believe that, and this is assuming their best case here, we'd say that land is extremely good, and people probably want to invest, per their own analysis, that land is extremely inelastic. What that means is a lot of these organizations, or a lot of these, like DOC, for example, can negotiate an extremely high price to be able to sell this property. And because they are able to sell this property at such a high price, that means better value. That means they're able to justify all their spending, and they're able to do things such as more initiatives. But we'd also say, to respond about this whole idea of empty land being unproductive, the first thing we just say is that it is unproductive. Their response here was to say that land is unusable, a lot of the land is unusable. But we just say that the land that is unusable is probably majority owned by the government, insofar as there's no incentive for anybody to buy it in any existence. But secondly, if they believe that they can exploit, if they believe that they can exploit housing, we believe they can also exploit a lot of people more. Okay, next then on farmers and iwi. They tell us that iwi can't operate now and farmers can't operate because it's a lot of land. The first thing I'd say is that it's probably not as big, but we'd say that, for example, a farm in Palmerston North or a farm at the very south of the South Island is probably less expensive than a farm, for example, in a richer area. But here, this is extremely important, I'd like you to know, because I will now flip this claim. We tell you that obviously, if it is cheaper, the tax, for example, in Palmerston North, in a lot of these more rural areas, it means that you are able to attract investment from elsewhere. Because relatively, the cost of production in the South Island is probably lower than the cost of production in Auckland. What that cost of production means is that it's Island split, and you're able to attract investment from all around the world. Fonterra doesn't build its factory in Auckland, it builds it in the South Island. We say that's obviously extremely good if you want employment, that's obviously extremely good if you want jobs, and if you want to uplift a lot of these rural communities. Away on why rural communities are so important later. What I've shown you here then is the means that we flipped their claim, because now you're able to attract more investment because the relative costs of a less developed region is a lot more cheaper. We weigh that highly because this flips their claim, and we therefore can co-opt their impacts in terms of farmers, etc. But even if you don't believe that, we say that the government being wanting to be popular, wanting to not get these people mad, these rural farmers mad, is likely going to reinvest a lot of that tax revenue. And we weigh this highly because it can actually invest in things that are extremely specialized. For example, it can invest in new tractors, it can invest in the best equipment. We say comparatively, when everything is just locked in land, yeah, sure, it's cheaper to operate, but you don't have high equipment, you don't have productive equipment. We need productive equipment in order to raise productivity and in order to create more output, for one thing. What that means is that even at the end of this then, it means that we flip their claim. We get more investment comparatively, that's a huge win. But let's take them at their best case, and let's say that farmers and iwi do not win. We'd say a few things here. First, obviously you have other taxes that are reduced, right? Mishti gave you good analysis as to why things like GST decrease. Mishti also told you why things like income taxes decrease. We'd weigh this on the most vulnerable people, and note my introduction telling you that this is extremely unbelievably unpopular, which means you need to justify this with a high cost. What that means is that the average person, the vulnerable person in the South Island, in the poor region, or in these poor farms all around the world, are able to put food on the table. They're able to send their children to school. They're able to support a lot of these initiatives. You ought to weigh that highly. At the end of this clash then, you have to believe that everything that they said isn't true. But even if you don't believe that, we weigh on the most vulnerable people within this clash. You're able to get more trade. They have to engage with that at third. Okay, moving on to this whole idea of rent and housing. Before that, I'll take a POI.
You tell us that there's all the land in New Zealand has been brought up and it's just sitting there empty. But then you also tell us that people can now invest and buy rural land. Which of these claims would you like us to believe?
We believe people can invest in a land, in a lot of these farms, etc. But even if we believe that they're able to sell these houses at a lot higher prices because they're able to negotiate, I already dealt with that response. Okay, onto rent and houses. Their main claim here was that rents are going to increase because landlords have power. Three, four responses here. The first thing I'd say is that obviously we offset the increase in the price of rent with other things, like for example a GST decrease, for example like an income tax decrease. We say that now people are able to afford such things, and therefore you are now able to spend on better things. You're able to cover this rent cost. Not all my analysis has shown you why you're able to get a lot of tax cuts, a lot of GST tax cuts, because it is so unbelievably popular per their characterization. What that means is that they're able to cover this cost and they're able to spend it on even better things. Secondly, we'd also say as the value of land increases and appreciates, it means that you as a builder will also be making a profit. This appreciation is likely going to increase because now you have more houses existing because you produce more as per Mishti's mechanisms. What that means is that you are able to make more profit as a builder in the short run when you have a lot of houses around you, which is to say rent prices do not increase, they are offset by a lot of the other taxes. But the final thing we'd also say here is that these people are probably extremely rich, and the government can do things such as consider state-subsidized housing, etc. We believe they have an incentive to cater to these people, so they're likely going to invest and make things like houses, make things like rent a lot cheaper. But even if you don't believe that, you ought weigh on the most vulnerable people and the principle. We told you that you ought tax the rich more and tax the poor less, because obviously these people are the vulnerable iwis, etc. that get affected. You ought weigh on them. If they are able to provide food on the table because their offset cost is higher, it means they're able to actually survive. It means that they're actually able to get jobs, actually able to benefit. But finally, on housing, and they tell us that there's an increased upfront cost to both buy it because you have to take out a mortgage, etc. But this presupposes, and the assumption of their case here, is that people can actually find houses right now. We told you at first that there is a significant housing crisis right now because A, there's lots of inefficient building, but B, there's no incentive to actually use a lot of this empty land. Mishti gave you two mechanisms as to why you're more likely to grow. Note that these were unresponded to. Firstly, she told you that there's an incentive to grow, and to use empty land, and there's an incentive to actually develop more efficiently because you need to offset those costs faster. What that means is you're able to get more houses, and here's how supply and demand works. When supply increases, it means there's more competition, and when there's more competition, it means you must provide a lower price in order to actually sell that house. That means if you take their supply and demand, we win because that's how supply and demand works. Supply increases, price decreases. That means that houses are able to grow fast now because of appreciation as well. But even if you don't believe all of that, you all weigh on the principle and you all weigh on these rural communities. These rural communities need this the most, and we all provide everything to them. We're able to do that when everything is cheaper, when they're able to get better equipment, when they're able to get more trade, more investment from other countries of the world, other places in the country. We all weigh that high.
Thank the speaker for their speech and invite up third Neg.
I think the affirmative side lose this debate in the case where they bank too many of their responses and too many of their mechanisms on this expressly finite pool of money that they get from this tax, right? You do not have an infinite money tree now that the government can use to fix all of the problems that we point out are happening to the economy on our side, right? A few things to do in my speech. Firstly, some notes on framing. Secondly, on the housing market. And lastly, on sort of the environment and rural outcomes. Okay, so firstly here, there's, again, a lot of the stuff that I flag in my intro, right? App's framing on the degree to which they have a lot of money to just throw at problems and fix them, I think is largely overstated. I think what this means that you as the panel, or one edge, I don't know, I didn't count, you have to essentially decide for them unless they do it in their later down the line leaders, like whether or not they get one thing or the other. They have to make a concession somewhere because they don't have infinite money. I also think App does not have the fiat to just cut all of the taxes to make everyone happy, right? This is a thing that comes out at second. I can see it getting whipped in the future, so I'm going to cut it out back here. We give you a lot of unresponded stuff as to how if you make investors more powerful, if investors and landlords are more powerful, they have more lobbying power, and this is at least equivalent to, if not more convincing to the government as an incentive, right? These people definitely do not want you to run like a progressive tax system, right? Even if you don't consider that these people have any say in government operations at all, which I think is silly, Mother Teresa level charity, right-wing people who are citizens still exist, right? I don't think justifying things means the same thing to everyone in the country. It could just as likely mean like doing something Winston Peters has come up with as it could mean something that like Dame Fiona Cooper has come up with. She's not a politician anymore. You get the point though, right? And so largely here, this framing, again, I think it's important to stress here that like amounts and price weigh out in value. You're like, yes, 1 acre in Auckland is more expensive than 1 acre in Otago, but we tell you how the stakeholders that we appeal to necessarily a lot of the time need a lot more, right? So let's talk about the housing market then briefly. I think the path to victory here is like, obviously we both want people to have houses better, right? They try and prove this by exacerbating the profit they get from this tax and essentially trying to prove that they get more development on previously empty land. The way that we win here, I think, is to prove to you that the average person simply has easier direct access to, on our world, to the houses that already exist, right? And also through this means of lobbying. So what happens to rent here? We tell you this like year 11 economics level supply and demand analysis, which I think is pretty convincing. I'm not a maths guy, but it makes sense to me, right? You have, if we can prove to you that there are fewer, not only fewer houses, but each house costs more to run because there's a higher tax on that house and its land. Note we frame to you how much of the value of a property is based upon the land that it sits on. I think we can prove to you that concessions are made to renters. Right. The response that we hear, right, is essentially if rent is really, really high, people like won't rent and the landlords will be like, that's okay, I'll lower it for you, right? And then we hear this idea essentially the rent stays low and the push that they get more houses, right? I think firstly, again, the cost of managing each property is a lot higher on their world. I think this means that you have to analyze these landlords and their incentives and what they're going to do. We characterized you and met quite thoroughly that they have a few options. They can sell some of these houses and therefore, right, this land, and they have less land to make less houses. Note, I'll prove to you later why this is really, really bad. Or, right, probably more likely, they make concessions. I think this means you as a landlord spend less money on making your rental properties like functional to live in and safe. I think this means that you increase the price, right? Because you have fewer properties to make, or at the very least you have the same amount of properties and you have more cost. I think when landlords have more cost, contrary to what Ronald Reagan would have you believe, they pass that on to the consumer, right? So what happens to the first time buyer here? We give you this really, really strong analysis, I think, that isn't engaged with enough, that these people are locked out, right? It is harder for the individual family to buy a house in their world, and it's something that they don't really contend with because they try to weigh it down, right? This is really, really important later on in the weighing. So, no, I'll do that, not, right? So in their world, right, I think houses are always owned by the investors, right? Or at least they're owned a lot more by the investors. Yes, maybe the investors build more houses, but this is still a problem because now that people are renting instead of buying houses on a large scale. I think this means the average person, the average voter, the average person with a family to look after has less financial security. They are banking more on Scrooge McDuck making sure that their housing situation is complete, right? They do not own the house themselves. Mortgages are more difficult to access. A house is simply a more expensive thing to buy on their side than it is on ours, right? I think that, yeah, here, so Essentially, the affirmative side makes land a burden that only the rich can bear. Therefore, we are relying on these rich people who now have a lot more lobbying power to the government to make equitable and safe decisions for the individual people living in their houses, who both sides agree are the most important people in this debate. I think if the most important person in this debate is a working class family, it is a much, much better outcome for them that they are able to get to a position where they own that house, where they have security, where they can do what Emily tells you and send their kids to a good school, right? Rather than there just being another house that they could potentially rent that in AF's best case is moldy and terrible, right? Also, what do we hear about building, this is like the last push here from AF. We hear that there's like more employment because you build more factories, you get more investment in less developed regions, right? I think this more employment is like marginal at best, right? A lot of time, if the only employment you are gaining is from the building of houses, yes, you get more employment opportunities for people who know how to build houses, but not for anyone else, right? I think with this factory stuff, right, there's a big cost, like inherently, you cannot claim that you get more houses if a lot of this land for your benefits relies on the idea that you build loads of factories on it which take up that same space, right? I feel like, again, these factories and the way that they are equitable relies on these rich people making these decisions, right, to have these safe working conditions that are really beneficial. I'll take a POI before I continue on.
Your counter-model was to tax the top 10% more. Doesn't that mean insofar as lobbying is symmetric on your side of the house, it's even worse because land is hard to move, but assets aren't that hard to move overseas?
No. So let's talk about the environment anyway, right? Like I feel like this is quite a unique path to victory to us, where we can like potentially gain a benefit that leads us closer to winning the debate, right? I think if we prove a unique, exclusive harm to the environment and things, notably non-profit organizations like the Orokonui Eco Sanctuary, who have a lot of land that is necessary to their operation, but they don't make a lot of money from that land because it's not very profitable to just have a lot of kias walking around. In fact, it's very, very expensive, that we tell you, right? So I feel like the effect of we don't really hear a lot of mechanistic response to this. I think we hear it way down. It's simply not as important, right? Why are these outcomes debate shifting? I think at the very least, like in the case that these places have less money, the government has to step in to subsidize them. That is more money that is coming out of AF's big money tree that they keep claiming to, right? There is a distinct incentive in New Zealand to keep these eco-sanctuary type places running because it is key to the government's stability and our identity as a nation, right? I feel like these places are having to take on more concessionary actions, right? They can hold less animals. It means that these places that conserve land have to take on more contracts from things like mining companies. I think this is super, super bad. Essentially, at the end of this debate, AF really needs to convince you why all the richest people having access to all of the houses is a really, really good thing for the average person. I don't think it is, and that's why I'm proud to be here.
I thank the speaker for their speech, reverse the speaking order, and invite the neg reply up.
Neg. Look, I think AF loses this debate when they don't actually get rid of any of our material on people, and instead just rely on GST, income tax, and all this magical money that they somehow get from the government. I think even if you just don't believe that you solve the housing crisis with a tax that the government would just implement if that was true, then I just think we win this debate. A couple of things to do. So a very quick briefing on framing, and then some general comparative of how everything adds up in the debate. So very quickly on framing, right? I think that there's a degree in which they have money, right? They don't have infinite money. I think we gave you a big push from this at Shay, and I think it was and some responses to this at Bev, right? I think the government doesn't just solve all the problems in the world in this debate. I think also here in framing, I think is note that quite unstrategically, AF centres a lot of their case surrounding like empty land. I think this is because they know they cannot win on land that is occupied by people, because they are the vulnerable people in this debate, and that knifes their own case. Okay, so then on people, I think the most important part of victory for us here. I think no, they just didn't contest with like the counter thing out of like, if you buy their like 10% material, we gave the counter model of also just tax their 10%. If you don't believe it, it just washed out of the debate and doesn't matter. But if you do believe it, we just claim all their revenue benefits and get all the other benefits alongside it. Okay, then I'm like, does empty land make money, right? They tell you that like if rent is high, people just won't rent the land. I think this doesn't engage with the fact that there is not another option here, right? When you choose not to rent a house, you can't just move away. That takes so much time and money and effort. We tell you these people are vulnerable from the very start. We tell you these people like probably just can't afford this type of stuff, right? I think they don't just buy a house as a natural outcome or move to like Otago. I think they just don't rent the house. I think they just have a terrible time. No, they just didn't engage with a lot of people that can rent material, right? We don't need to prove fewer houses, only more renters to win this debate, right? They have less security, less stability, they're more susceptible to future price gouges and economic failure, right? Like, even if you believe that people have slightly more money isn't $400,000 more to buy a house, right? These people can still cannot afford stability. They can still be taken advantage of by these renters. A few thousand more people living their life in worse conditions, making more financial concessions, eating less, moving more, just having a worse life is very, very important in this debate because these people are so vulnerable. This affects their entire life and how they live it for generations to come. This is super important. Then, briefly on iwi and dog and stuff like that, right? I think that they tell us that you can just this weird thing, you can take the money away, tax them, and then give the money back to DOC. I think this makes no sense. It's an extra step for absolutely no reason, right? Also, we tell you there are eco-sanctuaries that aren't just DOC, right? We give you Oregon, the Otago Peninsula Society, right? I think that you buy that people like iwi aren't just getting government handouts all of the time, especially when the government is making budget cuts, right? I think what this means is that you are actually helping these people. Maybe there's just quite a few less important spiritual spaces for Māori individual in their world. Maybe there's just less land to preserve native birds on. I think this is really terrible, right? I think maybe you get more tractors and slightly more efficiency, but I don't think this weighs up to the massive spiritual harm of taking the most psychologically important thing to you away, of not having that marae, not having that way to connect with the people you care about. Look, I think at the end of this debate, right, maybe rural communities get a boost for them, but there's more renters, right? There's maybe rural communities get smaller, but owning or renting a house is the difference between financial security and instability. Maybe more people are homeless, maybe more people just have a generally much worse life. I think this weighs so much higher in the debate, right? I think that at the end of this, you should believe the most vulnerable people are people we care the most about, that having a roof over your head is always going to be what matters. I am proud to stand.
Observe one thing. The quantity of housing underlies this entire debate. They want to talk supply and demand, but when quantity increases, that lets prices fall, that gives renters more power, we can win on their own metric, and yes, Shay, I will be working my split. Cool. 3 things in the speech. First, the conversation around tax burdens and what actually changes. Second, how we uniquely increase the quantity supplied of housing. And thirdly, and finally, my split, guess what, of farmers and rural communities. Cool. Question here, who faces the highest burden? At best for us, we tell you it's mostly the rich who can buy all of this empty land in the first place. If we take their best case, it's the average Joe who just happens to own a bunch of land. Note at the top of this that their most vulnerable stakeholder of renters don't own land at all. They don't directly pay any of that cost. In our best case, we have a huge amount of money flowing into government coffers, right? Because of all the astronomical property prices in Auckland, right? And that's so incredibly big because of over-speculation. In our best case, I think we can simultaneously relieve the burden on the average taxpayer, increase spending, but also note what Josh says about them uniquely increasing the lobbying power of the richest people in our society. But okay, if things are just neutral in this debate and no one gets a benefit, why can we still win? Why should you still give this point to F? First, we told you that the people who own the most value of land are likely to be business owners, the rich, and the most privileged in our society. What that means then is if you believe the principle of vulnerability for just a moment, you should already think it's enough to tip this over the edge for F. But then consider the marginal expense that increases on their side is just really, really small, right? So there are many people to pay this tax, they probably share the burden. The actual increase on the average person is not really that big. Cool. Let me move on then to the main clash around housing and rent. Right, the key conceit of this point then is that there is a terrible lack of incentive on the part of speculators who don't want to do anything with their land. I'll note the cases where this isn't true and how we still win on that. Look, let's put by the stuff about landlords wanting to screw renters over, wanting to exploit them and jack prices up. Two things here. First, unsure why this incentive ever changes on their side of the house, unsure why the extra tax cost actually stops them from doing that. What you should be very certain then about in this debate is there is simply more land to play with for property developers. Note a few things here. First, that is a huge marginal change, right? We force developers to use the land in less urban areas. Note the utter lack of comparative engagement on their side of the house, where you can build the most houses, where you have the most empty land. But then secondly, more marginal change because you force people to get the most out of their land. It looks like building more apartments, building up and trying to wring every last drop of capacity out of your land. What you should believe then, even if we take the best case about how we're building houses on like the foothills of the Southern Alps, our Alps, it's still like an increase in quantity for us, and it's also odd that an Otago team doesn't seem so keen about that. So, underlying this entire debate then is more houses equals cheaper rent, equals more choice for consumers, equals lower prices for people who want to buy. Uniquely, we win that most unfortunate clash. But then thirdly, how can we still win on rural communities? Yes, I'm whipping my split, big surprise. But so what do we actually see in this point? We see a transfer of economic power from urban centres like Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch to less well-off centres in like Palmerston North and Hastings, right? But the reason why I'm doing this is because it survives past third neg. Shay just tries to mitigate this. Even if it is a marginal change of like a couple dozen new jobs, you still have that principle of vulnerability. These are people who are losing their communities, losing their jobs. That's people who we can actually help, and that's the people who the government has the largest responsibility to help in this debate. If year 11 economics matters to you, vote for the side that gives you more houses, sociocultural proposal.
I thank the teams for such a wonderful debate. I invite you to cross the floor and then everyone can leave.
Can I borrow a piece of paper and a pen? For a ballot?